Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Can you hear
Great.
me okay?
Yeah, sorry, I got a fancy little device I got from a gas station to hold my phone up. So
Excellent,
one
excellent.
moment here.
I bought a fancy one to hold my phone, but it doesn't work very well, so I've got it like propped up and angled on books.
It's
And
exactly. That's the move. That's what these are good for, not for
yeah,
reading.
yeah. So, I'm ruining spending actual money on something that I now have to prop up with
Yeah,
books.
I don't know how long it is. Like if we keep doing this Zoom world thing, I'm gonna have to get one of those ring lights
Yeah.
so I can look good.
Yeah. I'm very light sensitive. So I get migraines from lights.
Mhm.
So like a light staring at me, I think would give me a migraine, but I would look good, so it'd probably be worth it.
That's all that matters.
Anyways, welcome everyone to our 20th niche conversation. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Bucky Stanton. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is my pen name is Bucky Stanton to honor my mother named me Nathaniel, but I go by my nickname Bucky, obviously. That's where you can find my work. You can find me at Bucky Stanton around the internet. I am kind of a anthropologist and a historian in a way. I'm an STS scholar, so I'm a fourth year candidate in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic, and I do anthropology on site at a archaeological dig that we'll kind of talk
Mhm.
about a little bit. That's near the site of the lignite mining, and that's how I kind of came in contact with the history and importance of this kind of titular form of Greek modernity, where you're hauling out this like basically wet coal and getting some energy from it, and that's how I kind of got immersed in that. But other than that, I enjoy aquascaping, hanging out with friends, reading books, being a miserable academic, that kind of stuff.
Awesome. So I invited you here today. We touched on it a little bit, but we have our Environmental Histories of the Future series going on. And you wrote something titled Futures Past, the Life, Death, and Future of Energy and Environment in Arcadia, Greece, 1950 to 2023. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I thought we'd kind of start off by talking kind of about identity. So you discussed this region in Greece in terms of identity and how it kind of represents a utopic metaphor. So I wonder if you could describe for us how this region plays into Greek identity.
Yeah, so I mean, we're all kind of familiar with like I had it in the original draft. I thank God Andrew, the editor, got out. But like, we're all familiar, at least in kind of the Western or Anglosphere world, with this idea of Arcadia. That's
Mm-hmm.
Arcadia with like a C. In the piece, I reference Arcadia with a K to reference the actual provincial space. But like, a new suburban development goes up, and it's like next to some old woods or something, and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
let's call it Arcadia, right? We know it as this really vague metaphor for like some sort of harmony or harmonious or, in our context, kind of suburban environment, if you will. But we also see it in certain kind of like nature brands. There's lots of like, there's a backpack company, there's various other brands in that kind of hiking world. If you get into the elite world of the discourses, there's also, there's magazines, there's things like that, but they don't draw a lot of relation to actual Arcadia. And so ancient Arcadia was hugely important to what we now, I guess, would call classical Greece, which we often
Mm-hmm.
think of like Athens or Sparta, those traditional sites. But for ancient Greek identity, there's just so much to talk about. But so the mountain of Lycaon, which overhangs the lignite mining and is the site that I work at, as I work as a topographical surveyor, so I snuck on there I don't know, I had to make myself useful in some way. But this site has two sanctuaries, one that was built later and one that was built earlier, and has material going all the way back to the late Neolithic, so 5,000, 4,500 BCE. And that's the Sanctuary of Zeus, which is this supposed spot where Zeus was born, the very god himself. I don't necessarily know all the details, but that was hugely important. So there's been this Sanctuary of Zeus there for thousands of years. It's a hugely important ritual site. but also the Parrhasians, who were supposed to be and mythically are the first kind of ethnic Greeks ever. They are originating from this location, from the lineage of a founding legendary hero like, Jason and the Argonauts. His name is Pelagus or Pelegus, and his son Lycaon, actually where the whole name comes from is that he did a ritual that involved like eating a human sacrifice, and he became a wolf, and it's a whole mythic thing. So anyways, to cut it a little shorter with all this detail, the lower site is well known because Pausanias, a geographer in the 2nd century BCE, walked around Greece and wrote about it, and he talked about the site and the importance of it. And the importance of it was that it was related to the city of Megalopolis, which just means big city. And the city still remains as a small town, which we'll get to later, but it was an important site because basically this city was built to resist Spartan aggression by the Arcadian League, an ancient group of city-states, and they worked to kind of bring together a bunch of communities. It's called a synoikismo, and it sounds nice, but it's actually by force that you kind of incorporated all these. So as a way of giving back and being like, okay, we forced you all to come live in this big, new, badly designed city so we can resist the Spartans, we'll give you a really cool sanctuary. So the lower sanctuary is really nice. But aside from that site, what's really important about it is that going far back, there's kind of river names like the Netha and other sites are taken as nymph names, like nymphs, like river nymphs. There's forest dryads, which are famous in Greek mythology, that are supposedly either hailing or heavily populated this region. And so that kind of indicates a long-standing relationship between this idea of humans and nature existing in some sort of like harmonious balance. And so that's the importance for the ancient identity. Do you want me to talk about the importance of it to modern identity as well?
Sure, why not?
Okay. And just like one more sentence on the ancient, there's a couple other really important sites near the site. There's the Temple of Apollo at Basai, which was built by the same Arcadian League to to celebrate basically the victory over the Spartans, more of a stalemate in a battle. And it's one of the best preserved sites in Greece for a huge Doric temple, which is a type of temple. And it's actually the first UNESCO site in Greece, not the Parthenon. So we'll get to that later as well, I guess. But there's also some other sites like Lycosura, the first city ever in Greek mythology, like their first ever. They thought they did it first. They didn't, but they thought they did. There's Trapezuuntis, which is the first like planned city ever, like in the Greek kind of cultural environment of that time. They thought that was the first one. And so let's jump to the modern now that I've said all that. Arcadia is less important because of its mythic overtones, if that makes sense. Those mythic overtones that I kind of talked about that we still have with suburban neighborhoods next to like woodlands called Arcadia and nature brands, that's actually derived from a kind of English romanticism that you could see in the like British painting, kind of aristocratic ideas of, moving away from that industrialism that we all kind of know of, like foggy, dark London in the 19th century. So that's why that image was popular. But in Greece, Arcadia is actually much better known on the national level. Greece has been like as a national story. It's important for a history of resistance. So as many may or may not know, the Greek nation was I think officially born as like the thing it is today, the entity, the nation state, the Hellenic Republic. It goes back to like 1822, 1826. And the Peloponnese, where the site is and where the megalopole in Arcadia is, it actually was deeply important as a site of resistance. So the Ottomans were a huge empire. Or the Ottomans, if nobody knows, were a group of Turkish nomads who came into Anatolia, conquered it from the Greek-ish ancestor or descendant of the Roman Empire in the East Mediterranean, the Byzantines, what we call the Byzantines, and they kind of took that over. And they also took over parts of Greece. So this area of Greece is extremely mountainous, but in a way that's not mountainous like like the Rockies. Mountainous in a way that's slightly lower, rounded mountains, and it makes it quite easy to jump between valleys and villages, right? So there's a lively village culture up there and has been for thousands of years. And so it was a really important site of guerrilla tactics against the Ottomans. And then later in the Nazi occupation, it became a really important site as well for resistance against the Nazis and communiques and that kind of saboteur work that was happening in the Nazi-occupied territories. And so really today in modern Greece, from my understanding and my research, Arcadia is really important in that history of resistance, that national history of guerrilla warfare and fighting a larger oppressive force and outsmarting and outwitting and using the land to your advantage, which I think also speaks to that ancient idea of like this harmony, right? It's less kind of a harmony in the modern context and more like the Greek land is being used by the Greeks because they're from here and they know it. So it's this interesting kind of relationship and this appraisal of the importance of it. And just to kind of, I guess, segue us here, it has remained really important as what I'll call like an energy periphery. And we'll get to that history, but lignite mining, which is a form of coal, has been going on since the late 60s, and it provides all of South Greece, including the areas that basically tourists go to. The islands and Athens in the surrounding region called Attica provides it with, remarkably cheap power. So it's important.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you framing it in terms of resistance when it comes to, that really clicked with me. Your piece got me thinking, because I don't know that much about Greece, and I was thinking about how everything I do know as a North American revolves around how it informs our own sense of self rather than Greece as its own entity. It's kind of like an appropriation of Greece as like this mythical self-identity in the past. So that's just something that your article brought up in my mind as I was reading it.
Yeah, I might as well say it to
Okay.
get it on the record here, but everybody who's listening or does listening should try and reckon and figure out if they agree with me or not. But honestly, like the idea of Europe is a giant modern scheme by a bunch of Northern Europeans to de facto control South Europe and use that historical lineage. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation, a whole other project about that historiography. But I mean, ultimately speaking, it's called a crypto-colonial relationship by one anthropologist of Greece. His last name's Hersfield, but I would encourage anyone who's interested in those kind of, is it colonialism, is it not, to engage with those ideas of paracolonialism or crypto-colonialism, because they really, I think, shine light on, what's still going on in the relationship with Greece. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing when I'm doing these conversations and I'm speaking with someone who studies something that I don't know a lot about, it really brings up to me questions as to why don't I know a lot about this topic or this region or what have you. And I encourage everyone to ask themselves that when they encounter histories and stuff that they just don't know well. So the heart of your piece, as you kind of touched upon already, revolves around lignite coal mining. So I thought for the middle part of our conversation, we could talk about how this mining affected the ideology and economy of the region through time, and like kind of how it started.
Yeah, so let's do a quick 10,000 year history. So you go back to the Pleistocene, right? The glacial movement in South Europe basically created a large lake in what now is the Megalopoly Basin and really the center of South Greece. And you have to remember to listeners that at that time the sea level was much lower, so there was more land to Greece. Right now, what is Greece is basically a bunch of mountaintops surrounded by water that has risen since the glacial maximum and the melting that resulted from that, in short. So there's this giant lake that's there that's kind of carved out by glaciers and filled in by melting glaciers. And what you have is a very rich ecosystem that begins. And so we have evidence going back to I think 300,000 years ago, and we're not just talking mammoths, say your whole megafauna idea. We're talking
Mhm.
that lots and lots of fish, indicating a really dense ecosystem, but also hominid, not even human. Probably Homo erectus remains. There's a really compelling site down in the valley. I forget the Marathusa, where they found a bunch of kind of like tools that indicate probably a Homo erectus like mammoth butchering camp. So just another layer of how long this history and relationship between nature and the environment and culture is going. It goes pre-human. So you have this lake, and what happens over time um, is that, and this is how normal coal is made. What we think of as coal, when you think like a hard piece of coal or black coal, you would put in sand, sand would put in your child's stocking or whatever.
Mhm.
It basically that is formed the same way, but what happens is all that organic material of that lake, it dies or it decays and it gets pressed down. It goes to the bottom of the lake and it's pushed down by the extreme weight of the lake. And so you get these that's how coal basically starts to be made. But the difference with lignite is that where some coals are millions of years old, this is only 300,000 years old. So mining, like the ability to mine that would come later, develops from this environmental relationship between the lake, weight, the creatures living there already. The lignite is literally like biogenic. It is energy. It is organisms turning the energy of the sun basically into different configurations, decaying, affecting the ecosystem, and then geological processes kind of taking over from there and working within it. And so if we zoom kind of back to the classical view we were in, people found bones down there. People understood that this material that was down there in ancient times, that is, they understood it was some sort of strange material, that there was bones in it. There's a wonderful piece on it that isn't published, but one of the directors at Mount Lycaon, that project, has written called "How Ancient Is Arcadian?" The answer is very, very ancient. And so if we kind of go back to that modern history, where now think we're at, let's think 1900. Lignite isn't being mined yet, but in other parts of Greece, they're trying to burn and mine coal. Up in an area north of Athens called Euboea or Evboea now in modern Greek, they tried to have kind of their first attempts at mines, but they all kind of got flooded. And soon the 20th century dawned, and it was a little too chaotic for a kind of industry. And I should preface here, before we really zoom into the Arcadian lignite history, that Greece is not a country meant to do well in modernity. It is stuck geopolitically between many large blocs and powers and alliances.
Mhm.
It does not have access to a lot of resources. It has certain mineral wealth, but it does not have like actual hydrocarbon wealth in the term of like oil or things that are like globally viable for an economy. This will
Mhm.
inform in a minute. So we're at that kind of point, right? Lignite's not being mined in, say, 1900 yet, but they're starting to try and mine coal or lignite-ish coals around. And so what happens is in the 20th century, eventually Greece is involved in World War One, the Greco-Turkish War. There's various slight fluctuations of the borders and decaying of the Greek borders to come to what is most kind of what you think of as the nation of Greece today. If you go on a Wikipedia page, that all kind of comes into place around 1920. And so going into the 30s and the 40s, what develops is a kind of a cultural conflict that develops in the 40s into a full-blown civil war. Which the Nazis would later intercede in. And that civil war is basically, like many places in the world, ideologically communist versus kind of Republican fascists. You could say
Mhm.
they're a mix of people who are kind of liberals on the government backside, or kind of straight up kind of more like Italian Mussolini fascists who are involved. So that's a mixed coalition versus the communists. And back to that resistance of history, that history of resistance, the Arcadians are still in the mountains, quite communist, and that was a communist spot. So let's think about how those ideologies and how liberalism and communism and all of these are in alignment in the way that they respond to nature and how to use it, right? They're all unified by a particular idea of how to use how to use resources, how to define what's natural and cultural. The boundaries there are not really different between a fascist government, a liberal government, and a communist government. They all come from the Enlightenment wellspring. They all come from that idea. So it's not like there was some disagreement about how to use these resources, but it was more that there was a conflict that destroyed lots of economic wealth. And then when the Nazis invaded, neither side was very happy in the Civil War, but they continued to kind of spar and trying to use the Nazis in various ways, as you would see in many saboteur conflicts in World War II. But through that resistance, there was lots of infrastructure damage. So what kind of modernity in terms of infrastructure and air quotes like technological systems had developed in Greece up until 1940? By the time the Civil War ends in basically 1950, they're pretty destroyed. They're either destroyed or they haven't been maintained. There's a lot of technical problems. And so Greece is now stuck in a geopolitical environment where that communism and that, kind of conservative side that was having the Civil War, that's really not settled in totality. Lots of communists are killed basically, and the other side declares victory, and they have backing from the United States, which will be important in just 1 minute. But it's not like a complete and total victory, right? So there's still parts of the nation that are in mountainous regions or rural regions that disagree. It's more of a presumed victory. It's not a complete closure. So this kind of, now we're in 1950. The Greek Republic is basically designed as an Athenian ideological project. It is the result of an intelligentsia who tried to, and there's a great book called The Classical Debt about this by Johanna Hanik, who is a classicist, and she charts the history of the creation of modern Greece and ancient Greece simultaneously, their co-production in the making of the nation state. So I bring that up because it's not like everybody in Greece in 1950 was like, we're part of the Greek nation now. It was more that there was this very centralized power source that was at the top of the political and economic hierarchy and had the connections to Western powers that were backing it. And the conflict that would continue was, do we go communist or do we go Western world? They would go Western basically. First world in the parlay of the time, not second world. And what would happen was, this modernizing Greece needs power resources. It needs to be able to have some industry. It needs to rebuild from the Civil War. And it looks at its, resource holdings, and this Athenian intelligentsia in the government basically schematizes the periphery regions of Greece that are outside of the urban areas, basically. It schematizes them as kind of sites to be used, right? What can they bring to the nation? How can we use them? And so having known that there were these kind of coal deposits throughout the country, the Western-backed power that is now kind of solidified after the Civil War gets the U.S. Department of Engineers to come over, right, in 1951. And they do a countrywide survey, basically, of the feasibility of using lignite as a potential power source. And I should say that this is a fraught question because lignite is very bad coal. It's very wet, if you could say. It's very young. It's not hard like the coal that we imagine. It has to be torn from the ground and sifted out in an extremely laborious process. And it's not very power efficient. It doesn't give you a lot of power for what you give into it. But because of the geopolitics of the time and the cost of importing coal, right, from elsewhere, and the general cultural and national uneasiness in Greece, that is, with dependence, with being kind of underlings after several hundred years of fighting larger powers and always being kind of a secondary or regional power, there's this great unease in the state and in the culture to being dependent. So they have this lignite report done by the Department of Mines, the Bureau of Mines, and it reports back that, yeah, you could use lignite. It's not going to be the most efficient. It's not going to be worthwhile, but for Greece's purposes, you can do this. Soon, the Public Power Corporation is formed. The Demosia Epicures, I forget the full name in Greek, but it's the People's Power Company. It's a nationalized power company, and they begin to move around the country and find lignite spots, buy them for government nationalized purchases, and begin scientifically evaluating them. And so in 1967, the site in Arcadia in the Megalopoly Basin is scientifically evaluated, and it's very young coal. It's going to be difficult, but it is possible. And so they buy up the land, and by 1971, they're burning. They're burning and making power. And so this is a big deal in the context of Arcadia for many reasons, but there was you could say centuries, at least half a century, decades long pattern already happening in Greece of extreme urbanization, a pattern that happens to today. People leaving the countryside in droves because what weird place Greece had found itself in that 20th century modernity, in the global economy, and even in the regional economy of the Eastern Mediterranean. They had no choice but to go to the city from the villages or the towns or the more rural places and engage in kind of service or light manufacturing jobs. So there's a depopulation that's happening. Lignite coming back, and that bringing back bringing back like a strong economic force to the region. It kind of re-enlivens the place. And that's why it's really important to this day for the people there to respect kind of the industrial history and heritage of lignite. It resuscitated Arcadia in many ways after also a devastating earthquake in 1965. Mm-hmm. So we're at basically 1971. We have lignite mining. The plants are getting built and upgraded. We know they can do it. It's a scientific and technical feat as well, because never in the world had there been this poor quality of coal used for power generation. And this is all going back, the substandard use of coal, to a long history of para or crypto colonialism that the Greek state was not unified in, not cohesive. Some departments trying to resist, some departments trying to make best use. A very complicated and fraught history for this young nation. And so with this lignite mining comes a number of things. And just to pin us down on a date, by 1980, for example, they're adding another cooling tower. They are expanding the mining fields. And this is when mining fields begin to kind of intersect with actual villages and depopulate those villages. So this force that had brought people back to the region ends up actually depopulating some villages in the valley. But nonetheless, we jump to 1980. Lignite is providing power, it's providing many jobs, it's providing a whole lot of things. But with it came, in the late 70s and early 80s, the renaming of like all the toponyms, so the place names in the region. And that is related to a really interesting history, because Arcadia, being this rural and mountainous place, has not always been purely Greek. There's been nearby Venetian, so like the Venetians from Venice in the 14 to 1600s. They variously controlled various towns. Their capital was at Nafplio, which is a very nice place if you want to have a nice Peloponnesian beach town experience. Today, that is. And so the Franks were there, who also had holdings in Sicily, who were a northern kingdom. And then later Slavic warlords from the Balkans, from Albania, from other areas around there, we're not sure on all the details, would migrate into Arcadia and establish kind of fiefdoms. And they weren't necessarily a nation, but they would be kind of arbiters of control that whoever was dealing with the situation needed to. And so lots of these place names were deeply Slavic before the 1970s and were renamed. So places like Veracla, which is very clearly not Greek if you know Greek, or Derbuni, were named to more classically refined names that fit into this new kind of unified national identity around this kind of constructed classical image that was aligned with this modernity and this position with the West and this crypto-colonial space, kind of trying to take the West's weird fetishization of the classical past and use it, but also use it to gain independence, but also rope them in a little bit. So this is all to say that it comes with these immense changes to the cultural region, what you name a place, how you interact with the environment and location. And it changes those kind of Slavic names or even Turkish names to very classical names, Likio, Netha, like the ancient nymph I mentioned earlier. And so I think that's part of the story too for the ideology of how you interact with nature and culture. Lignite comes in, it's this new relationship moving from kind of a peasant landscape, a land use like that, and moving to a enlightenment capitalist extractive format where nature is reserves for the nation to use to better itself in the geopolitical game to end all games. And the economic regions that were brought to this region, I already mentioned some of them, but I'll just close out this middle section. And thank you for all this time. It's hard to stuff it all in. The economic changes, I already mentioned that at first it enlivened a lot of the villages, but later as the lignite fields continued to need to fan out, right? And if you look on a map, I have a colleague named Kaya Kerner who sent me the Google Maps, satellite 2-decade feed of the lignite fields kind of expanding. You have to imagine that in this valley, there's all these, these agricultural villages, because the same thing that made the lignite coal, right, this rich biogenic history, also makes it a rich agricultural plain. So there's lots of people in that village, making traditional Arcadian goods. There's a particular culture of bread and pastry products that is still to this day very unique for the region. And so those people in the valley were gradually pushed out, and the villages kind of, quasi-abandoned to this day because of the lignite mining. So you have economic changes in the sense that this region becomes less tied to the agricultural past. It becomes less tied to this peasant landscape that had been there for hundreds of years. This land use that had, say what you want about feudalism, but was a little more in contact with the material realities of the environment and navigating that. And then so you have these economic changes. You have the coming of the UNESCO site at the Temple of Apollo not nearby. So all of a sudden the past starts to become important. The toponames are changed. They're making temples nearby, these famous international sites all of a sudden. But the changes to the region's economy, those changes are not really floating down. What is floating down to the average person, the average Arcadian in this period and to this day, is the benefit of the lignite industry. Again, why it's so important to this day. They're trying to resist the closure, which we'll get to the last part of this conversation. But the economic changes to the average person really come from that. They really come from the enlivening of the economy, from the ability of people to move back and be workers with union jobs who are paid well, who can collectively mobilize and kind of work together as a collective to defend their pay and their pension programs. And this, in many ways, is a golden age for this period that's looked back extremely fondly by the young people today and the people who I've worked with on this site at the Lignite and the archaeological sites. Anyhow, not to spread us out too much, but basically that brings us to the present day. And I should just also note that the economic changes that are brought through the lignite prosperity are your kind of your standard ones for a air quotes developing country moving into a kind of later modernity. The coming of the service economy, the rise of consumption, right? We're not talking white picket fences, but there's more of a rise of the consumption economy. There's particularly in Arcadia, it's much like many places in America where the truck, right, becomes a very important figure for workers to identify with. There's all these kind of consumptive changes with the technology people use and how they relate to the land. And I think just before we move on, that's a really good place to just tie all together that, still from the beginning of the story to now, 10,000 years ago to now, there's this ongoing story of relating with the land in different ways. And often I think we forget that our use of a truck, for example, in a rural part of America or in Greece, it is relating to the land in a way. And it is using our relationship and our assumed role with it and our position in the society to construct a relationship with nature or to suggest one.
Awesome. I have so many things running through my head from
Yeah,
what
I'm
you
I'm
said.
just I'm shotgun blasting you, and I apologize,
Yeah,
but I
no,
don't get
no,
many
it's okay.
opportunities.
It's great. Yeah, it's really, I love the you're highlighting that how it affected the workers, the actual people like living in the region, and the change of names and um, name changes are something I found really fascinating. In Canada, we talk about it a lot in regards to like Indigenous place names being, taken over by colonial names, or by like Indigenous place names being reallocated to a space. I was also thinking about it in terms of Asbestos, Quebec, which is a mining town that they established its name as asbestos. I can't say that word apparently. Anyways, it was they were super proud of that name for a while, right? Because that was their industry and that was their identity. And this past year, they voted to change it because it no longer is a positive thing. So I was kind of running through my head how these things change people affect people on the ground and affect personal identity and whatnot. So it's all very fascinating. But to wrap us up today, I thought we'd just talk about what the hell does this have to do with the future, and yeah, what's in store for Arcadia, in your opinion?
I mean it's all up in the air in a lot of ways, but
Yeah.
I think what's crucial is to see how, with the dawning of the state, even though Arcadia was this kind of heroic location, right? This place where figures like his name, like it's kind of like the general of the resistance to the Ottomans, Kallikatronus. I mean, this is like the territory, the famous battle at where we actually work below the site, Anacariez, which translates to like Upper Walnut. Funnily enough, there's a Cato Cariez, a lower Walnut as well in the valley. I just think that's nice. It's like at that side of Anacariez was this like very important battle, for example. So it's just like it's in your face, this resistive history and its importance to the formation of the nation state of Greece. But I mean, besides like, the people there are obviously extremely attached to that background, and the nation of Greece recognizes it as a place of resistance and importance. But despite all this heritage seems to really not be as important as its ability to act as a resource periphery, right? So there's been surmounting ecological crises from the lignite. I mean, where anything from the water table being kind of affected by runoff, the social damage of the like decay of the village structure, and the kind of the immense atmospheric damage that's come from the lignite smoke. I mean, when I'm working on the site in Arcadia, for example, there's certain mornings that the lignite smoke, you can not only smell it, I mean, it smells like sulfur, even though we're several miles away from it, or 5, 10 maybe kilometers away from it, I guess. It makes your throat scratchy. I mean, it's a quite damaging thing. And there's a whole health report on the internet. If you just Google HBG, Hans Bonds Galger, or whatever, it's some German anti-lignite association. They have a really good health report that wraps up all the kind of damaging effects of this. And just to note the kind of relationship between the past and present, pollution in the past, the site I've kept mentioning is the first UNESCO heritage site in Greece, the Temple of Apollo at Basai. It needed a huge polystyrene tent put around it in, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, to protect it from the lignite smoke, because the lignite smoke was decaying basically this like unbelievably pristine kind of ancient ruin. And I just think that's really interesting, kind of that shows you that we've moved from to like contemporary Arcadia, we've moved from this ancient harmonious image, we've moved right past into this kind of the peasantscape that I was describing, to the early modernity, to the using nature, and now we've moved to, we've got to secure the past and conserve the past, but also we need the lignite as the economic base. So, and how do we maintain those two things? So it's again, this story of human nature, environment folding and trying to make that relationship work, even though it's changed immensely. So let's get to the future of lignite mining. The state has long planned the departure of lignite, right? There's a lot of reasons for this. One, it's really not that cost effective in the kind of post 2008 economy. Since 2008, Greek workers have been disabused, have been extremely disabused. They've had pensions, and I think most people know this crisis is like the Greek financial crisis, but I'm kind of in a school of thought that I don't think it's anything to do with the Greek financial system, and it's more the state building system of the European Union and our strange kind of national debt system that we fund things with in the West. So this is all to say, I don't think it's appropriate to call it the Greek financial crisis. I'll just call it the financial crisis of 2008 and the effects. So with that, lignite becomes much more fraught, many less jobs. The jobs are much more contractual. They're not long-term. You have an immense economic impact on the lignite industry. And you have, as Greece kind of for a half a decade there kind of fought about being in the EU or not. If anybody remembers the Golden Dawn group, a neo-fascist group that was in part in Arcadia, but has faded away now, thankfully, after a referendum in 2018. Nonetheless, this is to say that the state has been planning on shutting down lignite because of the costs associated since the economic crises and the EU increasing climate regulations. So there's a lot of climate regulations coming down from the supranational organization, the EU, that are basically making it untenable to do this. And so the future of the region has been in contestation for, since 2010, 2015, before I got there. And my first field summer was in 2018, I think. So what's interesting, there's a couple unorganized, unalloyed futures participating. The first one that's been developing for the longest, I would say, at least in response to there's something called an ephorate, which manages the antiquities in Arcadia. Like, it's a department government system. And the people there have been attempting to, basically push forward the archaeological and cultural value of Arcadia to supplant or replace, is a better word, the value production of lignite. And that's been quite fraught because they face their own funding problems. But that has in part come from the great success of the Mount Lycaon excavation and survey project, which I've worked on on the American side, but it's a synergasia. It's a working together. So there's both Greek and foreign archaeologists, and it's a great, fantastic project. And it's been hugely successful in investigating the Sanctuary of Zeus, its surrounding sites, and really rewriting in a lot of ways what we think about center and periphery in the ancient Greek world and pre-Greek world, in the Bronze Age even, which I could go on for a whole other hour, but I won't. And so that's one future that's emerging, and it's really organizing around this really interesting, first of its kind in Greece, cultural and natural park called Parrhasian Heritage Park. And if you remember earlier in the conversation, or me yelling at you, less a conversation, is the identity of the Parrhasians was like the first Greeks. And so they're using that name to kind of create this cultural park that will protect both the ecological value, this kind of rural area that exists around the sites, and is in some ways untouched, in other ways, like the lignite mining, extremely touched, and they're damaged in many ways. And it creates a borders that crosses provinces, right? To remodel what was ancient Arcadia, the territory of it, and not just stick to the province of Arcadia, in hopes of creating kind of, a large, almost national park-like structure that will not only encourage tourism, because people don't come here. They go to Athens, they go to Mykonos, and they go home. They don't drive out to the Peloponnese. So that's one future that's emerging. And I had one of the Greek cultural professionals tell me, Arcadia's new heavy industry is archaeology. which I think is a really interesting way, again, to kind of frame the relationship between nature and culture in this space. That, like, we've shifted from cultural artifacts are now things to be extracted, right? They're now things to be formulated in the same kind of context as lignite, in the idea that it is schematized to be used for basically survival in the economic present. And then there's one more future that's really emerged over the last couple years, and that it threatens the previous one. And I don't want to just say that, you know, the archaeological and cultural and ecological heritage one is just inherently better in every way, because these things are fraught and organized and, you know, as I just reviewed, in similar extractive ways to lignite itself, right? It's not just this like black and white relationship between natural and cultural resources. They're both organized via dollar and cents, and they're both organized in shockingly similar ways. So the point is to say that that's not perfect, but it's something, and it's at least on paper sounds good. But then going into the future, in this past year or two, the government has really started to, rather than question whether it needs to close the plants, which has met huge resistance by the community, union leaders, people concerned for the economy of the region, or whether there'll be a town of megalopoly at all, which is about 5,000, 6,000 residents today. So the government, rather than thinking, maybe we should do this or maybe we should slow it down, they want to basically accelerate, right, the closure of the mining plants, keep the burning open long enough to use all the reserves they have, and then hard transfer to a new wind and solar economy. And that, again, is one of those things that in our black and white thinking in this late modernity, we think, oh, that's great, right? But there's a lot of problems with that. One, like lignite mining doesn't need a college degree usually, unless you're running the thing, right? And these are not people with lots of resources. These are rural people. They're, you know, who don't have access to the same education or accumulated wealth that people, you know, even in the middle class here in America or Canada would have. So it's extremely difficult, and you can't like get a certificate in lignite mining anyways. So you can go and work 3 months at the lignite and work another job. You can be a hand on a farm, and also, you know, there's a certain kind of rural flexibility that it brings workers, and it has allowed people to stay there and to re-engage and repopulate villages and recenter the place as important. But the government wanting to put solar panels all over the valley, one of their plans is to fill the mining pits of the lignite with solar panels, which I think is an interesting mixed use. But they also want to put wind turbines, and this is the one that's really controversial. They want to put giant wind turbines everywhere. And the problem, to go back to employment, is that these local Arcadians do not have the requisite skills to be workers on wind infrastructure. They don't have that work. Maybe they'll be smaller contractual positions, but it won't be the breadwinning or the money earning kind of center of the economy that lignite was. So there's that problem. But there's also the problem that, like, this is, and to center again on the relationship of nature and culture, this is a really important landscape. Not just in the sense of the cultural stuff, which I, would say that the ancient kind of sites, the cultural heritage of that is less important to most Greeks in my reading than that modern history, that landscape of resistance and that history of resistance to many different forces coming in and trying to kind of boss around and control or colonize or paracolonize the Greek peoples and this kind of rustic ancient land. And so I want to just close us here by kind of saying that future and that fraughtness that's emerging, or precarity that's emerging around, well, we could put wind turbines all over the mountains, but it's going to ruin this landscape that we're attached to, that has symbolic value, that is important to the nation, that is the very, air quotes, natural landscape that allowed us to resist the Ottomans, to resist various other invaders. And it's something that's the identity is so formed around. And I think one last note that's important is it's not like they want to put these wind turbines on just random mountains where there aren't important things, right? They want to put them right on the site of Mount Lycaon, basically, which is right next to Ano-Karyeze, where a hugely important battle was in the resistance to the Ottomans. So, it's not just that they want to put a couple wind turbines up. It's that they want to put like 72 up. It's going to be a big deal. And again, we see Arcadia schematized not as a place that's important, right? We see it schematized as a resource periphery to be used for the Greek nation, wherever the Greek nation may be. And I think it's worth asking, in the same way that we ask in America about like West Virginia coal miners, to ask, like, is this really the relationship that people should have with their environment and their government, where they are forced to just endure environmental and social catastrophe at any cost for a larger nation, and with no respect to that place? And so right now, and to actually close this off, there's a lot of contestation going on about the site. And what's interesting is they're trying to, about the site, I mean, about like all the new wind infrastructure, and the news reports that I've listened to and been able to understand. I'm working on my Greek. I'm not quite there, but I'm getting there. And I could understand enough that they aren't framing it this way. They're using the ancient past as something like important enough. They, in these news reports, these old village elders will say, this temple of Basai, the one with the tent I described earlier, it's the Parthenon of the Peloponnese. It's not, they have to use these representations that, they can't just say like, you're ruining our lives and this is going to be a big deal to our already precarious existence, and we shouldn't do this, and we should rethink how we use this landscape. They have to use this fetishized image of the classical past to show the centralized Athenian kind of intelligentsia that has continued on, that governs the country, that this is an important landscape and we should rethink it. Not because the people might suffer, but because our ancient image we construct will. And I think that is different and similar in ways to cases in kind of our more Anglosphere world, in a way that teaches us a lot about where movements should and can work with those categories of nature and culture. And interestingly, it's almost like the cultural ancient past in Greece has been naturalized like a natural resource. And that's kind of much of what my STS dissertation is kind of discussing at this point. The naturalization of the cultural and the temporal and chrono and literal like economic politics of that.
Cool. I appreciate that you made that connection between West Virginia and Greece, and because I was thinking about that a lot. I went to undergrad in West Virginia, so I think about that region a lot, and also Wyoming, or pretty much anywhere where fracking or coal mining or oil industry is, right? And yeah, we focus so much on the North American context, so it's really nice to hear about this happening in Greece, and to understand it, and to kind of bring connections between rural communities. And I also was struck by the proposed park, because I'm a park historian, and often parks are put in places where other resource extraction is no longer viable. So they're like in my studies, it's put where timber is no longer a possibility, or put where, for instance, Point State Park in Pittsburgh was developed to kind of erase the steel past and to harken back to this colonial mythology, and to profit from that, right? So that's, I was having all those things running in my head. But it's all very fascinating, and you've provided so much information today, and I want to thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for listening to me. I obviously my poor girlfriend is sick of hearing it, so I have a lot of pent up discussion, and who knows if with COVID I'll be able to go this summer, but I really hope. And I encourage anybody, not to interrupt you, but like just while it's on the brain, like if you go to Greece, which you should, it's an amazing place to go. It's cheaper than other countries. It's like going to Italy, but kind of like even less touristy. There's less people, and you can, if you don't go to the main sites, the sanctuary, not the sanctuary, the Delphi site, or Athens, like you're gonna have the whole site to yourself. So go to Greece if you want to see that ancient stuff, but also take a 2-hour bus ride to Arcadia and go to this place. It is a enormously important and just fascinating landscape, and of course incredible people.
Awesome. Well, I'll leave it on that note. I encourage everyone to read your essay on NiCHE. Pretty easy to find it. If you go to our website and search for just Greece, it'll come out. And yeah, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the chance to talk about my research.
Yeah, great. Bye.
See ya.